All right. So welcome. My name is Sarah Gladu. I work with Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust as the Education and Citizen Science Director. I welcome you to the class we're going to do for as a teacher training about Wabanaki living skills and culture. So here we are at the beautiful Whaleback Middens site, which is owned by the state of Maine Department of Conservation and managed by Coastal Rivers. We're going to take a little walk down the trail here. It is a wheelchair accessible trail, so it's a very friendly place for people of all ages and abilities to access. And there is a component of the trail when we get down towards the Middens that is not as wide or as flat. So maybe there will be people who can't access the bitter end of the trail, but most of it's quite accessible. And we do here at Coastal Rivers have a Wabanaki Fair coming up where we are taking materials to local schools and providing that to them. And so I'll be talking about some of the boxed and fair components while we're doing this training. So if teachers are accessing this video after the training has happened and would like more information about resources that are available for us, please reach out to us via email or any other way that you wish. All of our contact information is on our website at coastalrivers.com. I'm sorry, .org, O-R-G. So this site is actually currently mowed, and so you will have to kind of poke around for plants and things like that if you're trying to introduce them. But there's quite a bit still available, and we can talk quite a lot about plants and other resources that are here now that Wabanaki people have made use of on this landscape for thousands of years. So one of the things I like to do in the Wabanaki class is start with talking to students about who their ancestors are and find out if they know what is an ancestor and talk to them about that and who are their ancestors and where are their ancestors from, because we need to make this personal on some level as a starting place so everybody has a place to relate to another group of people's culture. And then a really important part is to talk about their ancestors. Maybe some of them have ancestors or relations who are Wabanaki, and it's important to connect with the students about that. Some students won't know, and that's fine too. And and some students will have a lot of information about their ancestors, so that can be a really important part of this. In terms of who are the Wabanaki people, another interesting part of this is that for a lot of our teaching, we talk about the Wabanaki people's past, and we talk about how they've lived on this landscape for thousands of years and made use of resources here, but they're also still here in our communities and living with us, and they drive cars and trucks and go to schools and that sort of thing. So that's a really important part of what we need to reach out to students about, because you'll be surprised perhaps at how many people, including young people, think that Wabanaki people are gone, not here, and not present on this in our communities. So that's very important. If you bring your students to this site, there's quite a lot to talk about. And one of the things that I always start with students, once we've sort of talked about who the Wabanaki people are, they are here in Maine, and there are actually 4 tribes, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet. For those of you accessing the Midden Trail through our Wabanaki Fair, some of this is spoken, is illustrated and documented on our signage, and you can share that with students. So there are 4 tribes. There are reservations in Maine, just like there are all over the United States, and there are a lot of Wabanaki people who are both living on reservations and living more amongst us in the wider community throughout the state. So when we start talking about Wabanaki people living here in the past, I almost always start with, well, you know, there was a time when there weren't any people here, and why was that? And we talk about the ice age, um, that the Wisconsin Glacier covered this region, and there it was inhospitable to people and animals and plants. And then when that glacier receded, some 12,500 years ago, at that point, plants could start to come into this region, and it also you could have animals, first insects and birds and things that could fly, and later on mammals. And the environment here was entirely different because this topsoil had been scraped off. And so it was really a lot of bare rock and gravel and not a lot of soil. And so the plants that were able to live here were more like lichens, fungi, mosses, algae, things like that. Of course, the ocean was teeming with wildlife, and it was a rich natural resource here. Even shortly after the last glaciation and its receding. When you visit this site, there's a nice overlook where you can get a kind of a view through the apple trees. And so I'm going to turn my phone around now. Tracy, at any point, if you have comments or questions or whatever occurs to you, just jump right in. But I'm going to turn this around so I can show you the view. There, whoops. There we are. Oops, I always do that. Try again. Okay. So, as you're standing on the bluff, you can talk a little bit about, well, if you were here 1,000 years or 5,000 years ago, this land would have looked different. The plants would have looked different. And what would that have looked like? Well, after the last glaciation, of course, there was very little plant material growing on the landscape. But then eventually this topsoil did form. And after those lichens and algae and fungi were living here and decomposing for a period of time, you did start to have small plants and eventually larger plants and eventually conifers. The climate was cooler, and so it was a lot of conifers. And if you look across the hill right from where I'm standing on the other side of the estuary, the other side of the Damariscotta River estuary, there are conifers over there. So we still have lots of pine trees and tamaracks and other spruces and so forth. So that's not gone from our environment, and that's a really useful tool to talk to the students about. What did it look like? Well, it looked like much of what we still see in some respects. But apple trees, for example, which is apple trees fill this field, and we did not have apple trees in this area until colonists brought them. So from this area, you can, however, get a good sense of, what the topography is like. And there's a path, but then on this side, there's a stream. Well, if you were settling here for a period of time and you were looking for things to eat and making sure that your people had water, this might be a good place to settle and live. You can ask students, where would you put your shelters? Where's a place that would be warm, that would get the morning sun and free from, hard winds that might come up the river valley here? Where would you find food? Where do you think the animals would be living on this landscape that you might be hunting? Where would you find fiddleheads in the spring to be able to feed people for their vitamins and after a long hard winter? So that's always a great place to start. And talking about the seasonality of food as well is really a critical component of thinking about Wabanaki life here for thousands of years, because of course it wasn't like going to a grocery store and picking up whatever you see on the shelves. And I think a lot of times I use with students this idea that, hey, you go to the grocery store and you can always get macaroni or spaghetti or whatever it is. And that simply is not possible if you're living off the landscape. When strawberries are ripe, they're available, and you might want to eat them and pick them. But strawberries are only ripe, and available for a short period of time in June. And then the bears and the birds have eaten them and they're not available anymore, or they've rotten and fallen off, and so they're not available for that reason. So, how much you organize your life, if you know that there's a seasonality with respect to food. And um, a lot of times I've seen teachers make really great charts with students, maybe like a monthly chart. What would be available in your area? And you could even have the students do this at home, especially if you're doing a virtual day, for example. They could look around their backyards and see if they can find things that are edible or wildlife that could be hunted, for example, and make a list. If they find that they see ducks in a pond near their home, for example, well, when can you hunt ducks most successfully? Well, when ducks are molting in the later part of the middle of the summer, for example. Well, it's actually earlier summer, in June. When ducks are molting, they're much easier to hunt. So, that would be something to discuss with students. When are raspberries and blackberries ripe? That, in July, for example. Um, so going through, the seasons with students and talking about what food would be available on the landscape at any time is a really interesting activity and really informative. Of course, they won't know a lot of edibles, and so maybe providing them with a short list of wild edibles. And if that's not something you are finding among your own materials, we can certainly provide that to you. A lot of people don't know, for example, like inner bark of pine trees is highly edible. And so that's something that was eaten. In fact, the word Adirondack means bark eaters, because it was common in the Northeast for Native peoples to eat bark, especially at times of year when there wasn't a lot of fiber available. It was a lot of protein that was consumed in the wintertime. So one of the things that's going to happen is, after I talk sort of generally about um, some of the content that I wanted to cover with people, Angela's going to talk a little bit about some of the activities and so forth that are available to you. So we'll give you a little flavor of that as well. But I did want to talk a little bit about the Middens specifically while I'm here, because they are right across from Great Salt Bay. You start to see the shells on the trail, and so you can point that out to students as you go down the hill. These are oyster shells, and one of the cool things is that I actually didn't realize until fairly recently. So right here on this part of the estuary, we have shell heaps, or middens, sometimes called, known as trash heaps, or however you want to call them. Here we have oysters, and if you go south of the bridge in town between Newcastle and Damariscotta, all the middens that are elsewhere on the river are all, and there's quite a few of them, they're all clam, soft shell clam. And then if you go over to Great Salt Bay, kind of just around the corner from where I am towards Lincoln County News, there's a few middens, two or three middens in that area, and those are all quahogs. So people were foraging for different things, even in a relatively small area. And one of the great questions about this site is, was it, small numbers of people coming here very regularly for 1,500 years? Or was it, larger groups of people that were visiting this area for short amounts of time, just on a seasonal basis? And honestly, we don't really know the answer to that, but there are some archaeologists that are doing some work to look at that question and try to understand better a little bit about kind of what the habits of people. I mean, this is about looking at the middens is really about, as one of the archaeologists I know, Alice Kelly, says, putting the people back on the landscape, because you're really trying to understand, these were people, these were individuals. They had lives, they had communities, they had places that they were connected to, and their ancestors are still here living in Maine. And those are the people that are today's Wabanaki people. So here I am on this little bluff. There's a mining whaleback kind of a interpretive sign here and a steep bluff, and you can see kind of you get a sense anyway of the depth of the shells. A tremendous amount of shell material here, even though it was mined. And so there was a huge industry in the late 1800s of mining the shells, using them for fertilizer, using them also for chicken feed to make the shells harder on the eggshells for the chickens. And so a lot of this midden is actually gone, and it used to go all the way up this hill, and now that's not the case, but it's still huge. And so this side is called Whaleback, and the other side is known as Glidden. And when I go a little bit further, I'll sort of show you that site. This interpretive sign, if you show it to the kids, it does have some great pictures of kind of what this area looked like in the 1800s, and it will give people a little bit of a sense of the scale of the operation. The factory did eventually burn in the late 1800s, and that kind of put an end to this industry on this site. So there is this little trail that you're welcome to take the students on. You'll see shell pieces all along the trail. This is a state archaeological site, and so we ask, and the state asks, that no materials disturbed or taken from this site, but certainly, encouraging the kids to take a look is part of being here. So that's great. And I'm just kind of going down towards the river, and the Route 1 bridge is on my right, and there is some poison ivy up to my left, and so I would encourage the students to stay on the trail here. But as you go out towards the bluff where you can look over and see Glidden Midden, you get a really good view. Ducks going by, mallards, and there's some cormorants out there swimming, and there's the Glidden Midden over across the way with all the pine trees on top of it. And that's a really huge site and extraordinary. That was actually highly disturbed when they put Route 1 in, and so Route 1 is just up here. Unfortunately, it's not as intact as it was, but it is still a cool site. And if incidentally anybody wants to walk over there, there is a great trail. You park at Lincoln County News, and there's a loop, and it goes out along the Great Salt Bay. It's about a 3-mile loop altogether, and then you go actually through a sheep tunnel under the Route 1 highway, and then back sort of the same direction, the opposite direction. So anyway, it's a great walk. It's probably not something you can do with the students, but it is an interesting site. So any comments or questions kind of about looking at the site or what's here, things that we've talked about so far?
Nothing I can think of. Just curious, did they mine like the clam middens or the quahog middens, or was it just the oysters?
It's a great question. I don't know of any other factories where it was intensively mined, but people may have used some of those other sites to some degree as well, kind of on a non-industrial but more personalized scale. So I don't know the real answer to that.
I wasn't even aware of those other middens, so that's pretty cool to know, to share with the students.
Yeah, I should actually count how many there are that we know of. We're still discovering new ones because as the sea level changes and as storm surges happen, we actually are uncovering some new ones that we didn't really know about. And we're also kind of putting the word out there as well. And so people are saying, oh, I have property and we see shells in it actually just happened last week. I looked at a site over almost down in Booth Bay, or it actually is in Booth Bay. And there's a clam. It's small, but it's a clam midden on private property, and these folks had us come out and take a look.
That's really great. That's cool.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, we are part of a statewide program called Midden Minders, which is looking at, we are documenting what we're losing due to climate change on the Middens, because it is archaeological artifact that we're losing, for one thing, connected to the Wabanaki culture, and secondarily, it's a way to kind of understand what is the impact further of climate change, storm surges, and related issues. So it's interesting. Angela, is there anything you'd like to add kind of to what we've talked about in terms of this?
Not that I can think of at the moment,
Okay.
but I'll chime in if I do.
Okay. Well, actually, I was thinking maybe this is a good time for you to go ahead and start talking about some of the activities and the fair and so forth, whatever you'd like to share with folks about activities. And if I come across any plants and things I'd like to share, we can do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have actually quite a few activities, and these are all going to be in a Wabanaki life skills and culture loaned kit that Coastal Rivers has created. And when we were creating these activities, we kept in mind the learning standards for each grade and kind of tried to base the activity off of those. So in large part, like kindergarten through second grade, those activities focus more on what culture is and what contributes to a community's culture. So with Wabanaki specifically, the activities are more surrounded or more about oral tradition and storytelling. One of the activities specifically is one that Sarah actually does and is a really great one, where we will read a story or tell a story from the Wabanaki people, and the students will sit and listen to it, and then we task them with getting into small groups or something of that nature and retelling the story that was just told to them. And this is a really interesting activity because you see how oral tradition can change from person to person or generation to generation. And it also kind of gives you an idea of the difference between oral tradition versus reading a story, because there is a difference there, and kind of talking about how that contributes to a culture, whether it specifically be Wabanaki or maybe even just other communities around us as well. And then moving into third and fourth grade.
Oh, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Can I add one thing, Angela, while you're talking about that? So one tidbit of information that might be helpful to know is that the Wabanaki peoples, none of the tribes had written languages until very, very recently. And so the importance of oral traditions is paramount in terms of conveying information, teaching family histories, teaching people about relationships to other tribes, teaching about traditional ways and spiritual elements of the culture. So, all kinds of things are conveyed through oral tradition, and it's something that's basically foreign to us at this point. So the activities that Angela was talking about sometimes yield some interesting conversations.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sorry. No, all good. That was great. Thank you. And then, so moving into the upper grades, I guess, third, fourth, maybe fifth and sixth, a lot of the learning standards were centered around geography and how geography has played a role in how we as humans, past and present, interact with our surroundings and what resources and tools that we can get from that. So for third grade, the third grade activity specifically, we have a story that was told by David Moses Bridges, who was a Passamaquoddy Native American, to Sarah, and Sarah Gladu typed it up in her own words, and basically it centers around or the moral of the story comes down to having to what needs to be done to prepare for different seasons, kind of like what we had talked about earlier in this webinar, or what Sarah had talked about. So I created, I guess, kind of a game or I wouldn't call it a relay race, but basically after you read the story and kind of talk about how how they prepared for winter, how we prepare for winter, how what happens if you don't prepare for winter, if you don't have access to grocery stores or strip malls for winter clothing. So this activity, you split kids up into small groups, and there are 3 rounds. The first round being 5 minutes, the second round being an additional 10 minutes, and it goes up like that. But basically you task the students with preparing for winter as a group. So pine cones could represent the meat that you have to gather. Acorns could represent the fruits and vegetables, if any, that are around. And then they also are tasked with collecting tiny sticks to represent fire kindling, and also building a shelter. So the idea of having different time increments is in 5 minutes, let's see how many resources can be gathered within those 5 minutes, and would that last the group for a winter? And then adding on more time and adding to the pile would simulate if you had started preparing for winter earlier in the season, etc. I hope that makes sense. But that was the 3rd grade activity specifically, since you teach 3rd grade, Tracy.
That sounds great. I love that.
Yeah, it's kind of fun, and they get really involved in it, and it's a good demonstration of teamwork versus if you were just an individual trying to collect for an entire family or yourself, what have you. And then going into the higher grades, still centered around the geography. Like for 4th grade, I have a bunch of maps of the different territories of the different nations that make up the Wabanaki Confederacy. And by looking at the different maps and also maps of how the glacier that covered our space shrunk over time, kind of giving the students an opportunity to hypothesize, I guess, if you will, what resources were available at that time and how the location of the people would affect their day-to-day lives. Like, for example, living here near the Damariscotta estuary and the Damariscotta River, like Sarah was talking about, they would have access to a lot of shellfish, and also traveling via waterways. And that's something to focus on, I guess, instead. And yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too muddled.
No, that's good. That was made sense to me. How does that sound, Tracy?
No, I think that would work well too. I'm going to reach out to those 4th grade teachers.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
And then just some other activities that Sarah, we may or may not be able to demonstrate is the birch bark etching, which is a huge hit for students and teachers alike. It's a very fun activity. So a how-to is in that box as well, and also some birch bark pieces, so you guys can all try your hand at it yourselves.
Are you familiar with the birch bark etching, Tracy?
I am.
Okay, great. Okay, so I won't belabor the issue. So there'll be instructions, like Angela says, so you guys will be all set.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Is that where we got to the end of that part, Angela?
I think so.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, and I just want to mention one other just sort of general thing that you can try with students, Tracy. It's just kind of anything that has to do with asking kids to make something with natural materials is a great challenge for them, and sort of talking in general about, so what is technology? You know, and a lot of times the kids will say, of course, so computers or cars or things along those lines. I'm trying to switch my phone around again. Come on. And there we are. And so, you know, actually making something from natural materials is always more complicated than it sounds. And if you want something to be really functional, there's always sort of nuanced details that are hard to get at unless you really try. So for example, I have brought with me, this is a basket that's made of a piece of birch bark on the bottom, and it's stitched, I think it's actually stitched with dental floss maybe or something. And then it's got pine needles that are, and I actually know how Native people used to do this, how they would bundle them and how they would take their sinew and stitch it, and how they would decorate the insides potentially with that is actually porcupine quill that's decorated with on the inside.
Wow.
And but the point being that, like, if you task the kids with something like, okay, kids, make a basket for carrying berries, or something specific like that, out of pine needles, because that's what you have. You live, let's say, in that little pine grove right outside GSB. So you have pine needles. It's an accessible resource, and you need a basket, because without a basket, you can't carry your belongings. So everybody make a basket. Well, it's a whole lot harder than it seems, and it's definitely possible, but it's hard. And if you really want the basket to like hold together for a month, it's even harder. If you really want it to work, it's always harder than it looks. Just like making an arrowhead out of a piece of rock. Everyone thinks that's going to be relatively easy. They're going to whack the rock and the arrowhead's going to jump out, and it's not like that. And anybody who's tried it knows, but it's a great experience for the kids to try that sort of thing. And you can do flint knapping with kids, but it does require goggles. So that's why I thought the pine needle basket concept, you could give them some dental floss. You could give them, even a stiff piece of round cardboard for the bottom, and see if they can make a basket out of pine needles and cardboard. And I hope they succeed, but if they don't, that lesson is just as good, because you can say, look, this is really hard. Like, living out here without some of these pre-made things that we kind of take for granted is complicated. Like, you actually have to develop the technology so it works for you. So anyway, that's just sort of a general, and but teachers could do that in so many ways. It's just sort of a matter of looking at what's outside the school and saying, okay, let's make something like a basket or a piece of clothing or a shelter, or a tool. And it's always harder than it looks, and it's a great lesson in terms of becoming familiar with something from the natural environment. So like if you're working with pine needles, for example, or cattails, all of a sudden the kids are becoming really familiar in a very intimate way with that plant material. And suddenly, like, if you wanted to make a science unit out of aquatic plants after working with cattails, the kids know those aquatic plants in a very different way than if they had never tried to make something like a mat out of cattails. All of a sudden they know already that the inside of the stalks have hollow chambers, things like that, because if you haven't worked with it, you just don't know that. So making things out of natural materials gives them an intimate knowledge that can be really moved into a science kind of experience very easily. Could also be moved into a language arts writing kind of experience, where if you're writing a poem or integrating into a story, or even doing sort of a writing activity where you're talking about Wabanaki people on the landscape. Well, the kids' knowledge then of the cattails or the pine needles is entirely a different level than if they hadn't handled that material themselves. So that's kind of just a general synopsis about partly why we do this program, and partly how it can be turned into kind of other learning opportunities for the kiddos.
Absolutely. I love that idea too.
Yeah.
And we have an outside classroom area, like Kelly has a certain space and I have a space, so we can just go out there and they can work and collect things. So
very perfect. Yeah, that's great. Well, unless Angela has anything she'd like to add, I think that's kind of where I'm happy wrapping it up.
Yeah, no, I think that we touched on everything that I had thought to speak to.